The card was folded white cardstock, calligraphy printed, sitting perfectly centered at the place setting between the crystal water glass and the bread plate. My name, or what they'd chosen to put where my name was supposed to be, read, "Idiot Trash." 2 words. Calligraphy. Like someone had thought about it. I stood there for maybe 4 seconds before I understood what I was looking at. The table was still filling up around me, people finding their seats at the Cascade Room inside the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle, chandeliers throwing gold light across $40,000 worth of floral arrangements, a string quartet in the corner playing something classical I couldn't name. Claudine was 3 seats down, already laughing at something her boss Renata said. She hadn't noticed I'd gone still. I picked up the card, held it between my fingers, read it again. Idiot trash. And then Renata looked over. Renata Hale, founder and president of Hale Meridian Communications, one of the most respected mid-sized PR firms in the Pacific Northwest. A woman who had appeared on 3 consecutive covers of Seattle Business Magazine, and who my wife spoke about with the reverence most people reserve for religious figures. Renata looked at the card in my hand, and she laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not a polite, embarrassed laugh. A full, delighted laugh, the kind that makes the people around you turn to see what they missed. My name is Sterling Marsh. I'm 48 years old. I was born in Tacoma, raised in a house where my father worked 2 jobs and my mother kept the books for 3 small businesses out of a corner of our kitchen. I built my first company when I was 26 with a $40,000 personal loan and a used laptop, and I sold it 11 years later for more money than I'll ever fully spend. Today, without anyone at that table knowing it, I was the silent majority shareholder in a small media and communications holding company called Trident Pacific Group, which, as it happened, was Hale Meridian Communications' single largest client. I set the card back down on the table. I pulled out my chair. I sat down, poured myself a glass of water, and I smiled at Renata Hale like I hadn't seen a thing. Because I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do. But I knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent 22 years making decisions that cost real money, that whatever I chose to do would not be impulsive. The night had a long way to go. Before I tell you what happened at that table, before I tell you what I said to Renata when I found her later that evening, and before I tell you what Claudine's face looked like when the full truth came out, you need to understand how I got to that room in the first place, and how a man can spend 16 years married to someone without knowing who they are in a room full of people they're trying to impress. I met Claudine in 2009 at a fundraiser for a children's literacy nonprofit at the Seattle Art Museum. She was 31, working in corporate communications for a mid-sized biotech company in South Lake Union. She was sharp, composed, and she asked me a question about arts funding that made me think for a full minute before answering. I had never had to think for a full minute before answering anything at a fundraiser. I asked for her number before the cocktail hour was over. We dated for 2 years. I was careful, not because I didn't trust her, but because I had learned, through the process of building and selling a company, that the most expensive mistakes are the ones you make when you're in a hurry. I watched how she treated people who couldn't do anything for her. I watched how she handled conflict. I watched how she spoke about her family, her colleagues, her past. What I saw seemed good. She was kind to waitstaff. She was direct when she disagreed with me. She called her mother on Sundays and meant it. We married in 2011 at a small ceremony in the Cascades, 26 people, no one wearing anything they'd be uncomfortable sweating in. For the first several years, the marriage was solid the way good buildings are solid. Not exciting, not dramatic, just built right. Claudine moved into communications consulting and eventually landed at Hale Meridian 6 years ago. The work suited her. She was good at it. She came home energized in a way she hadn't been at the biotech company, and I was glad for it. What I didn't immediately notice was the way she began to edit herself around me once Hale Meridian became the center of her professional world. The way conversations about work gradually became performances rather than reports. The way Renata Hale's name entered our household with a frequency and reverence that began to feel less like professional admiration and more like something else. Renata said this. Renata thinks that. Renata's approach to client management. Renata's philosophy about communication strategy. Renata, Renata, Renata. I'm not a jealous man. I have never been the kind of person who needs to be the most impressive person in the room. I spent enough years being the least impressive person in the room that I lost interest in that particular competition entirely. So I didn't read anything threatening into it at first. What I did notice, about 2 years in, was that Claudine had begun to describe me differently depending on who was asking. To her family, to our old friends, I was Sterling, her husband, the one who'd built a company and made some investments, a quiet type, not flashy, good with money. To Renata, to the Hale Meridian world, I was something slightly embarrassing. I don't know exactly when I understood that, but I did understand it. It was in the small hesitations before she answered when someone at a work function asked what I did. It was in the way she summarized my career in the most deflating possible terms. He's sort of semi-retired, he does some investing, he keeps himself busy, as if the goal was to leave no impression at all. I kept those observations to myself and filed them carefully, the way I file everything. If any part of this feels familiar, stay with me. And before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every comment. Now, let's keep going. The Hale Meridian Annual Gala was Renata's signature event. She held it every April at the Fairmont Olympic in downtown Seattle, which is the kind of hotel that has been hosting the city's important evenings since 1924 and knows it. The Cascade Room seats 300 people when fully configured, and Renata fully configured it every year. Tables of 10, fresh flowers and colors coordinated to the theme, a seated dinner, a program, remarks, awards, the whole production. This year's theme was Partnerships That Endure, which was, in retrospect, a spectacular piece of unintentional irony. Claudine had been planning her attendance for months. She'd gone to Nordstrom on Pine Street 3 times before deciding on a navy dress with a structured bodice. She'd had her hair done the morning of the event. She was, in every visible way, preparing for something that mattered to her more than she was saying out loud. I asked her once in the week before whether she'd told her colleagues much about me. "What do you mean?" she said. We were in the kitchen of our house in Laurelhurst, the one on the east side of the neighborhood where the lots are slightly larger and the view of Lake Washington is partially visible from the second floor. "Just what I asked," I said. "Does Renata know what I do? Have you talked about my background much?" She got a look I had learned to recognize, mild impatience wrapped in careful neutrality. "I've mentioned things," she said. "It doesn't come up a lot. It's a work event, Sterling, not a show and tell." I nodded and didn't push, but I noted the quality of the answer. The ballroom was full when we arrived. I knew perhaps 4 people in the room. A woman named Patricia Stokes, who ran communications for a regional hospital system, and who I'd met once at a conference downtown, and 3 clients of Trident Pacific, who were there in their capacity as Hale Meridian clients, and who recognized me with the slightly uncertain politeness of people who can't immediately place where they know you from. Claudine moved through the room the way she always did in professional settings, efficient, composed, slightly ahead of me. She found her table, did a quick scan of the place cards, gave me a smile that was more directional than warm, and said, "You're right there," gesturing to the seat 2 down from hers. I walked to my place and picked up the card. Idiot trash. 4 seconds. The understanding arrived not as a shock, but as a slow, cold settling, the way temperature drops before a storm rather than during it. I want to be honest about what I felt in those 4 seconds, because I think it matters. I didn't feel hurt the way I might have at 25. I didn't feel rage. What I felt was something more like recognition. The way you feel when a suspicion you've been carrying quietly for a long time is finally confirmed by actual evidence. It's not satisfaction. It's not relief. It's closer to the feeling of a diagnosis after years of vague symptoms. At least now you know what you're dealing with. I sat down. Renata Hale was at the head of the table, which was her table, the prestige table at this event, the one with the partners, the senior staff, and their spouses. She was 62, silver-haired, wearing burgundy, with the kind of posture that comes from 40 years of knowing her presence was expected and met. She had looked at the card in my hand and laughed. To her left was a man I didn't know named Garrett, her head of strategy. Across from me was a woman named Devon, who did media relations, and next to her was Claudine's direct supervisor, a man named Philip, who had the manner of someone who had learned to mirror Renata's emotional temperature at all times. There were 5 other people at the table whose names I learned over the course of the evening. Associates, a junior partner, someone's husband who looked as out of place as I did, except without the secret I was carrying. Claudine had gone quiet when she saw me sit. She knew I'd seen it. She didn't say anything. She looked at her menu. Renata composed herself and tilted her head toward me with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and appraisal. "Sterling, is it?" she said. "Claudine has told me a lot about you." "Has she?" I said. "She says you're retired." "Semi-retired," I said, the same word Claudine always used. I watched Renata's face while I said it. She didn't try to hide the slight downward adjustment of her estimation, the nearly imperceptible way a person reclassifies you when the word retired confirms what they already suspected. "Enjoy it while you can," she said, and turned to Garrett. The next 90 minutes are the part of the evening I want to describe carefully, because what happened wasn't dramatic in the way movies make conflict dramatic. It was more interesting than that. It was the kind of evening where you sit inside your own silence and watch everything very clearly, and what you see is something you can't unfeel afterward. Claudine did not look at me directly for the first hour. She laughed loudly at Renata's stories. She inserted observations into the table conversation at precise moments, like someone who has been in enough of these evenings to know exactly when to speak to be noticed without appearing to try. She was performing. Not in the way people perform when they're lying. In the way people perform when they have separated the person they are in one room from the person they are in another room, and the effort of maintaining that separation has become invisible to them through sheer repetition. I ate my dinner. I was polite to everyone at the table. I asked Devon about a media campaign I'd read about in the Puget Sound Business Journal, and she was visibly pleased that I'd heard of it. I asked Garrett about a development in Pacific Northwest infrastructure communications that Trident Pacific had been monitoring internally, and the name of the specific project I cited made him sit up slightly. But I didn't explain myself. I just asked questions and listened to the answers and let the evening move. The place card sat folded near the bread plate. Nobody had moved it. Philip glanced at it once during the soup course and said nothing. One of the junior associates looked at it with the fixed gaze of someone working very hard not to react. At the hour and 15 mark, Claudine finally looked at me. It was a careful look, a reading look. She was trying to understand whether I was upset, whether I was building to something, whether she needed to manage whatever was about to happen. I met her eyes and smiled the same smile I give clients in a third-round negotiation. Calm, attentive, revealing nothing. She looked away first. The program began after the dinner plates were cleared. Renata stood at the podium at the front of the room and gave remarks about the firm's year, about its clients, about the theme of enduring partnerships. She was a gifted public speaker, controlled, warm where she needed to be warm, authoritative everywhere else. I could see why Claudine admired her. I could also see, very clearly, that Renata Hale was a person who had spent decades at the center of rooms like this one and had come to believe, without examination, that her assessments of people were permanently correct. She mentioned several clients by name, including the major ones. She did not mention Trident Pacific by name, which was, again, unintentional irony. Trident Pacific didn't advertise its client relationships, and Renata didn't know who Trident Pacific's ownership was. That was by design. I listened to her speak, and I thought about the card at my place setting. I thought about the fact that someone at a table of 10 adults had decided, in advance, with calligraphed precision, to seat a man with a card that called him idiot trash. That it had been prepared that way, not scrawled in a moment of pettiness, but written out, folded, placed. That when it was discovered, the response from the person who ran this firm was laughter. I thought about what that meant about what Claudine had told them. Not the exact words. I'm not interested in the exact words. What I'm interested in is the portrait. What portrait of Sterling Marsh had Claudine been painting in this building, in these conversations, at these lunches she came home talking about, that made 2 words on a calligraphed card seem reasonable? Funny, even? I thought about my father, who worked the early shift at a paper mill in Tacoma, and came home smelling of chemicals and effort, and who told me once that the most dangerous thing you could let someone do was decide who you were before you walked into the room. I thought about the 43 employees currently on Trident Pacific's payroll. I thought about the 3-year contract with Hale Meridian, renewable annually, currently representing approximately 31% of the firm's revenue. And then the program ended, and the room shifted into the cocktail portion of the evening, and I excused myself from the table and walked toward the bar. I want to pause here because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, why didn't he just leave? Why sit through dinner? Why stay for the program? Why not walk out the moment you saw the card? The answer is the same answer I've given in every boardroom where someone tried to use a moment of ambiguity against me. You don't make your move on their timeline. You make it on yours. I wasn't there to make a scene. A scene would have been satisfying for about 40 seconds, and then it would have become the thing that everyone talked about. The husband who caused a disruption at the Hale Meridian Gala. That story would have been useful to certain people and not to me. What I wanted was a conversation. A private conversation, at my chosen moment, with the person who runs this firm. And I wanted that conversation to happen when the emotion had been fully replaced by clarity. The bar was set up on the south end of the room, near the tall windows that look out over Fifth Avenue. The city was doing what Seattle does on April evenings. Not quite raining, the air carrying the smell of the Sound and the last of the cherry blossoms from the 4 trees I'd passed coming in on University Street. I ordered a bourbon and stood at the edge of the room and waited. She came to the bar within 10 minutes. Renata Hale, president of Hale Meridian, still carrying the warmth from her own remarks, accepting congratulations from people as she moved through the room. She came to stand near me while the bartender finished making her drink. "Sterling," she said pleasantly, "are you enjoying the evening?" "I am," I said. "You run a beautiful event." 30 years of practice." She smiled. "I hope the dinner was to your liking." It was. I paused and turned toward her slightly. "Renata, I want to have a brief conversation with you, if you have a few minutes tonight. Not here, somewhere quieter. I think it might be useful for both of us." She read me with the quick assessment of a person who has spent a career reading rooms. Something changed in her expression. Not alarm exactly, but the activating of attention. "Of course," she said after a beat. "The library lounge on the mezzanine is usually quieter. Shall we?" The mezzanine lounge at the Fairmont Olympic is one of those rooms that seems to exist specifically for important conversations. Dark wood paneling, low lighting, leather chairs, the murmur of the main event 1 floor below distant enough to feel like white noise. We sat across from each other in 2 chairs near the window. A server came and I told him we were fine. Renata crossed her legs and looked at me with the professional composure of someone who has negotiated media crises for 3 decades. "What's on your mind?" I reached into my inside jacket pocket and set 2 things on the small table between us. The first was the place card. Idiot trash. I had picked it up from the table during the cocktail hour quietly, without making a point of it. The second was a business card, not the one I carry as personal identification. Those I rarely use. The one I set down was a Trident Pacific Group card, the institutional one, with the company name and my title, Sterling Marsh, Majority Principal. Renata looked at both items on the table. She was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be straightforward with you," I said, "because I think you're a person who prefers directness and I prefer it too. So here is the situation exactly as it is." I told her what I'd seen. I told her what I'd watched happen at that table. I told her what I had concluded over the course of the evening about what portrait Claudine had been painting for this firm's understanding of who Sterling Marsh was. I did not raise my voice. I did not use language I would regret. I said each thing once and said it clearly. Then I picked up the Trident Pacific card and held it facing her. "Trident Pacific has held its Hale Meridian contract for 3 years," I said. "It represents, based on your firm's last annual report, approximately 30% of your total revenue. I am Trident Pacific's silent majority shareholder. I have been, since the company was formed. Claudine does not know this. Your firm does not know this because that is how I chose to structure my involvement. I've never had any interest in using my financial position as social leverage, and I want to be very clear that what I am about to say to you has nothing to do with threatening that contract." Renata's expression had not changed in the way I expected. There was no performance of shock. There was instead the very still face of someone who is listening with the entire body. "I am telling you this," I said, "because you need to have accurate information in order to make your decisions. You run a firm that advises companies on communications, on reputation, on how to be seen correctly by the public. And tonight, at your table, at your event, my name card read, 'Idiot Trash.' And when you saw it, You laughed. I paused. I think you are intelligent enough to understand why that is relevant information for you to have. I set the business card down on the table and pushed it toward her. Effective immediately, I said. I am cutting my personal ties to this event and this table. I won't be attending future Hail Meridian functions as Claudine's guest. That is my personal decision and has nothing to do with the Trident Pacific relationship, which will continue to be managed at the corporate level without my involvement in the social dimension. I stood up. I think you're a talented executive, I said, and I don't doubt you've built something real here. But I'd encourage you to think carefully about the culture that makes it reasonable to put something like that on a place card. That culture comes from somewhere. I buttoned my jacket. Have a good evening, Renata. I walked out of the mezzanine lounge down the main staircase past the marble columns in the lobby, out through the doors on University Street, and into the April air. I drove home to Laurelhurst and sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and my phone on the table face down, and didn't do anything else for approximately 40 minutes. Claudine came home at 11:37. I know this because I was watching the clock in the way you watch a clock when you're not sure what you're waiting for, but you know you're waiting. She came through the door and stopped when she saw me in the kitchen. You left early, she said. I did. She set her purse on the counter and didn't take off her coat. What happened? Where did you go? I looked up and you were just gone. I had a conversation I needed to have, I said. Then I came home. She looked at me for a long moment. I could see her assembling the pieces in real time. My expression, the stillness, the fact that I was still dressed and sitting at the kitchen table at midnight. With who? She said. Renata. The name changed the temperature of the room. About what? Her voice had gone careful. The performance was over. This was the real voice, the private voice, the one I'd been married to for 16 years. The place card, I said. She didn't say anything. Her jaw moved slightly, the way it does when she's choosing words. Claudine, I said, I'm not going to ask who put it there, and I'm not going to ask what you've been telling people at that firm about me. I think I know enough of the shape of it to understand it. What I want to ask you is something else. She looked at me. Is this who you are when I'm not watching? The question sat in the kitchen between us. Outside, the lake was doing what the lake does in April, invisible in the dark, present as a sound, an absence you can feel rather than see. She started to cry. Not the performance cry, the real one, the one that happens before the words are ready, the one that starts in the chest and comes up involuntarily. I recognized the difference because I had been married to her for 16 years, and in 16 years you learn the difference. I don't know how it got like that, she said. Renata has a way of, it's been years, Sterling, of feeling like who you are doesn't fit what they respect. And I think I started agreeing with things instead of correcting them. I stopped defending you, and then I was telling the stories myself. I nodded slowly. What kind of stories? She wiped her face. That you were bored. That you didn't really understand what I did. That you were... I called you simple once. I remember saying you were simple and watching them laugh and not stopping it. Simple, not idiot trash. But the same gesture, the gesture of trading something real for approval, of cheapening one thing to elevate another, of deciding that the acceptance of people she wanted to impress was worth more than the accurate representation of the person she'd chosen to build a life with. That's what I needed to understand, I said. I want to be honest about what happened next, because this is not a story about a clean ending. Real things don't end cleanly. Real things end slowly, or they don't end at all, or they end and then begin again in different forms, and none of that makes them simple. Claudine and I spent 3 weeks in what I would describe as sustained, difficult honesty. We talked in the evenings at the kitchen table, neither of us performing, neither of us trying to win. What emerged was a portrait of a marriage that had been drifting in a direction neither of us had named out loud. Her need for validation from a world that valued a certain kind of success, and my habit of staying quiet about things that cost me, assuming silence was the same as peace. We went to see a counselor, a woman named Dr. Anastasia Reeves who practices in Eastlake, and who has the excellent quality of being entirely unimpressed by anything either of us said about ourselves. We're still going. I am not going to tell you that everything was resolved. I'm not going to tell you that Claudine and I are on the other side of this. What I will tell you is that the truth came out, which is the precondition for anything real to happen, and that the truth came out because of 2 calligraphed words on a white card, and because I chose to sit through an entire dinner before I decided what to do about them. About Renata Hale. She called me 2 days after the gala. Not to apologize exactly. I don't think Renata Hale has the vocabulary for the kind of apology that situation called for. But she called to tell me that she had reflected on our conversation, and that she understood the implications, both personal and professional, and that she wanted me to know that whatever I chose to do with the Trident Pacific relationship, she hoped I knew the laughing response at the table had been a social reflex she was not proud of. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her the Trident Pacific relationship would continue at its current terms, and that her account team would not see any change in how we operated. I meant that, and I held to it. I also told her one other thing. I told her that the most useful thing she could do, professionally, with everything she now knew about that evening, was to think about what it meant. That a table of 10 highly educated communications professionals had felt comfortable with a place card like that. Not because someone was malicious. I don't think it was malice, at its heart. I think it was something more common than malice. I think it was the habit, in rooms full of people who value a certain kind of status, of treating people without visible status as fair game for small diminishments. Your firm's job, I said, is to tell people how to be seen accurately. That's a harder job to do when your own table is making assumptions. She was quiet for a moment. That's fair, she said, and I think she meant it. 3 months have passed since the Fairmont Olympic. I've been back to that hotel twice, once for a business breakfast in the Georgian Room, and once for a meeting with a portfolio company whose CEO prefers the lobby bar. Both times I walked past the hallway that leads to the Cascade Room and thought about a folded white card in calligraphy. What I keep coming back to isn't the humiliation exactly. The humiliation passed quickly. It passes quickly for most people who have experienced the collapse of a company, the rejection of 200 investors, the very specific public embarrassment of a business failure reported in a local newspaper. You build a tolerance. What I keep coming back to is the question it raised. Not the question of whether Claudine loved me. I believe she did and does, complicated and imperfect as that love had become. The question it raised was the one I asked her in the kitchen that night. Is this who you are when I'm not watching? Because that is the question that matters. Not in marriages only, in all of it. In the company you build and the people you hire and the clients you choose and the way you speak about someone when they leave the room. The version of yourself that exists when no one who knows you is looking is the actual version. Everything else is positioning. My father taught me that. He didn't teach it to me with words. He taught it to me by being, at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday in Tacoma, exactly the same person he was at every family dinner on Sunday. Exactly the same person he was in every conversation I ever overheard. There was no other version. He had never found it useful to have one. I think about that a lot. I think about what it costs, over time, to maintain a different version of yourself in different rooms. I think about how that cost accumulates quietly, how it erodes the original, how eventually you look at the person in the mirror and realize you have been playing a role so long the actual thing has gone blurry. I think Claudine is thinking about that too. I see her thinking about it. And I think that if 2 calligraphed words on a white card at a table in the Fairmont Olympic is what finally made both of us look at what we'd each been letting slide, then those words, as ugly as they were, served a purpose. The place card is in my desk drawer. Not the top drawer, not in plain sight. The second drawer, under a folder of documents I rarely open. I kept it because I believe in keeping evidence of things that teach you something. Not to look at it often, not to stay angry. Just because some things deserve to be preserved in their original form, rather than processed into a softer story. Idiot trash. Calligraphy. Fairmont Olympic Hotel, Seattle, Washington. April. The quietest people in the room almost always know the most about what's happening in it, and they choose when to speak. You know what stays with me about Sterling's story? It wasn't the place card. It was the dinner. The man sat through an entire meal, smiled, asked questions, ate his food, while carrying something that would have made most people flip a table. That kind of self-control isn't coldness. That's a man who knows exactly who he is and doesn't need the room to confirm it. And I think that's the real lesson here. The people who humiliate you are always counting on your reaction, They've already written that part of the story. Sterling just refused to play the role they cast him in. If you know your worth, truly know it, you don't need to prove it in the moment. You choose your moment. That's not weakness. That's the most powerful thing a person can do.